Have you ever experienced a moment so perfect, so incredibly reckless, that it completely shatters your reality the second it ends? Welcome back to the channel. The journey you are about to hear is a work of fiction, intimately inspired by the real, breathtaking romance confessions you share with us every single week. I was still tasting the dark coffee and lingering heat of Brooklyn's kiss on my lips when the harsh, flashing glow of my phone screen dragged me violently back to earth. It was Mia, my absolute best friend, calling from halfway across the world, completely unaware that I had just crossed the one boundary we swore I never would by falling into her older brother's arms. My heart was still hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs as her name flashed on the screen, trapping me between the lingering thrill of his touch and a sudden, crushing wave of guilt. How do you look your best friend in the eye when your entire body is still humming from the one man who was supposed to be strictly off limits? The secret was already burning a hole in my chest, and Brooklyn had made it dangerously clear in that SUV that he was completely done playing by the rules, leaving me to wonder how long I could possibly hide this beautiful, terrifying collision course from the people I loved most. Before we find out what happens next, please take a quick second to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from right now. Settle in, take a deep breath, and let's dive straight into part 2 of today's story. The phone vibrated violently against my palm, Mia's smiling contact photo flashing like a warning siren in the dim light of my entryway. I took 3 deep, jagged breaths, desperately trying to steady my racing heart and smooth down my messy hair before I finally swiped to answer. Mia's bright voice immediately filled the quiet apartment, complaining about the brutal time difference in Tokyo and the terrible hotel coffee. I forced a bright, completely unnatural laugh, carefully angling the camera away from the flushed heat still burning on my chest and my visibly swollen lips. She casually asked how the demanding penthouse project was going, completely oblivious to the fact that her older brother had just shattered every single professional boundary I had ever sworn to protect. I swallowed the thick, suffocating knot of guilt in my throat, lying effortlessly through my teeth as I told her everything was moving along and strictly business. Hanging up 20 minutes later left me feeling utterly exhausted and deeply ashamed of my own reflection. I couldn't do this. I absolutely couldn't be the woman who destroyed a beautiful, decade-long friendship over a reckless, undeniable physical attraction, no matter how much my body craved him. By the time I walked into the architectural firm the next morning, I had made a firm, agonizing decision. I was going to shut this down before someone got seriously hurt. I spent the entire morning aggressively reviewing dense vendor contracts, determined to keep my mind completely off the intoxicating memory of Brooklyn's hands gripping my waist. Around noon, the heavy glass door of my office swung open without a single knock. Brooklyn walked in, moving with that same effortless, commanding presence, but this time there was a visible, striking shift in his energy. He wasn't wearing his usual impenetrable corporate armor. His expensive silk tie was loosened, and he looked genuinely exhausted, as if he hadn't slept a single wink either. He closed the door firmly behind him, the heavy click sealing us in the quiet room. I immediately stood up from my desk, tightly crossing my arms over my chest to create a defensive physical barrier between us. I didn't give him a chance to speak, quickly blurting out that last night was a massive mistake that Mia had called, and that I simply could not lie to my best friend anymore. I fully expected him to step closer, to use that heavy, magnetic silence and his physical size to intimidate me into changing my mind. Instead, he stayed exactly where he was by the door, running a frustrated hand through his dark hair, a gesture so raw and entirely human it completely caught me off guard. He looked at me, his dark eyes stripping away my practiced professional speech, and quietly admitted that he hated putting me in a position where I felt forced to lie to the people I loved. The unexpected vulnerability in his deep voice cracked my defensive walls right down the middle. He didn't push forward or try to touch me. He just stood there, fiercely holding my gaze across the room, and told me that he would keep things strictly professional during office hours if that was exactly what I needed to feel safe right now. I let out a shaky breath I didn't realize I was holding, a tiny, foolish sliver of relief washing over me, until his jaw tightened and he added a low, dangerous promise. He warned me, his voice rough and incredibly steady, that I could dictate the temporary rules while we were working, but the exact second this massive project was finally finished, he was going to prove to me that what happened in his car wasn't a mistake, and he absolutely wasn't going to let me hide behind my guilt forever. For 3 agonizing days, we stuck to the script perfectly. Brooklyn played the role of the demanding, distant client, and I buried myself in the safety of my architectural renderings, becoming the efficient, untouchable professional. The air in the office was so thick with repressed tension, you could practically taste it, but we never crossed the line. We didn't touch. We barely made eye contact for longer than a few necessary seconds during site walkthroughs. I told myself this was a victory, that I was successfully killing the attraction by starving it, but I was lying to myself. The distance didn't make the feelings fade, it just pressurized them, turning every polite nod and curt email into a torturous reminder of what we weren't doing. By Wednesday evening, the carefully constructed dam finally began to crack, not with a grand romantic gesture, but with a shipping disaster. The custom, hand-carved mantel for the penthouse fireplace arrived in 3 broken pieces, just 48 hours before the final inspection. I was alone at the site, staring at the jagged wood in horror, my phone pressed to my ear as I tried to scream at a logistics manager in Italy. I didn't hear the elevator ding. I didn't know Brooklyn was there until he gently took the phone from my trembling hand, ended the call without a word, and set it down on a stack of drywall. I spun around, ready to defend the delay, but the look on his face stopped me cold. He wasn't angry. He looked tired, his tie undone and hanging loose around his neck, his sleeves rolled up to reveal his forearms. He quietly asked me to stop panicking, his voice calm and grounding in the chaotic room. He crouched down beside the broken wood, running his hand over the fracture. I knelt beside him, the smell of sawdust and his familiar cedar cologne mixing in the air. For the next 2 hours, we weren't client and architect, and we weren't forbidden lovers. We were a team. We sat on the dusty floor of that multi-million-dollar penthouse, brainstorming a redesign that would cover the damage using local stone I had in storage. It was messy, exhausting work, sketching new ideas on scrap paper while sharing a lukewarm bottle of water. I watched him sketch a rough concept, his brow furrowed in concentration, and I felt a dangerous shift in my chest. It wasn't just lust anymore, it was admiration. I was falling for his mind, for his patience, for the way he listened to my ideas with total respect. When we finally agreed on a solution, the relief was palpable. I laughed, a genuine tired sound, and leaned back against the wall, closing my eyes. I felt him shift beside me, his presence warm and solid. When I opened my eyes, he was watching me, his face inches from mine. The playful camaraderie evaporated, replaced instantly by that heavy, magnetic pull. He reached out, his hand hovering near my face as if he wanted to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, but he stopped. He pulled his hand back, his jaw tightening as he remembered his promise to keep his distance. The restraint was infinitely sexier than if he had kissed me. He stood up abruptly, offering me a hand to pull me up, but keeping his grip loose, impersonal. He told me to go home and get some sleep, his voice rougher than before, leaving me standing there in the dust, trembling not from fear, but from the terrifying realization that my professional boundaries were protecting absolutely nothing. The finished fireplace stood as a testament to our late-night salvage operation, the rough, locally sourced stone looking far more elegant than the imported marble ever would have. It was the night before the gala, and the penthouse was finally silent, stripped of the chaotic noise of contractors and drills. The only sound left was the hum of the city 64 floors below and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Brooklyn stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, 2 crystal tumblers of scotch in his hands. He turned, the amber liquid catching the low light, and walked toward me. He didn't smile. There was no triumph in his expression, only a raw, darkening intensity that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. He handed me the glass, his fingers brushing against mine, lingering just long enough to send a familiar, aching shiver down my spine. We clinked glasses in a soft, clear chime, a silent toast to the completion of the project, to the professional victory we had pulled from the jaws of disaster. But as the whiskey burned a warm path down my throat, I knew the real danger hadn't passed. It was standing right in front of me, wearing a charcoal suit and looking at me as if I were the only structural element that mattered. He set his glass down on the island with a definitive click and took a step closer, invading my personal space with a deliberate, predatory grace. He murmured that we had followed every single rule, met every deadline, and kept every promise to keep things professional. His voice was low, a rough velvet texture that vibrated against my skin. He asked me, his eyes searching mine with devastating clarity, if I was finally ready to admit that the job was done. The question wasn't about architecture, and we both knew it. The heavy, suffocating wall of denial I had built for weeks crumbled in an instant. I didn't answer with words. I simply set my glass down next to his and took a step forward, closing the final inch of distance between us. The moment my hands touched the lapels of his jacket, the restraint he had shown in the dust of the construction site evaporated. For a brief second, reality snapped back into place. Mia, the consequences, the life I could lose. I pressed my palm flat against his chest, not to stop him, but to breathe. "If we do this," I whispered, my voice unsteady, "there's no hiding tomorrow." He didn't rush me. He didn't argue. He simply held my gaze. "I don't want hiding," he said quietly, and this time I was the one who pulled him closer. He groaned, a deep, guttural sound of surrender, and swept me up, his mouth crashing down on mine with a hunger that was terrifying in its intensity. This wasn't the tentative exploration of our first kiss. This was a demand, a desperate, consuming need that had been simmering for a decade. I tangled my fingers into his hair, pulling him closer, needing to feel the solid reality of him against me. We moved blindly backward, stumbling slightly until my back hit the cool, smooth wall of the hallway. He didn't stop. His hands were everywhere, frantic and possessive, learning the curves he had only been allowed to look at for weeks. The friction of his suit against my silk blouse, the heat of his skin, the scent of cedar and desire. It was a sensory overload that drowned out every logical warning screaming in the back of my mind. There were no more blueprints, no more best friends, no more consequences. There was only the friction of skin on skin and the desperate, breathless rhythm of 2 people who had waited far too long to collide. He lifted me effortlessly, and I wrapped my legs around his waist, burying my face in the crook of his neck as he carried me through the shadows of the penthouse. We didn't make it to the master bedroom. The expensive leather sofa in the living area became our entire world, a blur of tangled limbs, ragged breaths, and soft, broken whispers of my name that sounded like a prayer. It was passionate, unhurried, and overwhelmingly intimate, a physical pouring out of every secret feeling I had hidden since I was 20 years old. But as the storm finally quieted, and I lay safe in the circle of his arms, watching the city lights blur through the glass, the euphoria began to fade, replaced by the crushing weight of reality. I traced the line of his jaw in the darkness, realizing with a sinking heart that while we had just built something beautiful, we had also just set a match to the only bridge back to my old life. Waking up to the blinding glare of the morning sun reflecting off the glass skyline was a harsh, beautiful return to reality. The leather sofa, which had been our entire world just hours ago, now felt exposed in the daylight. I sat up, pulling Brooklyn's discarded suit jacket around my shoulders, the scent of him instantly flooding my senses and making my heart ache. He wasn't beside me. For a terrifying second, the cold dread of regret settled in my stomach. The fear that to him, this was just a conquest, a way to blow off steam before the big launch. I stood up, my legs shaky, and walked toward the kitchen island where the smell of fresh coffee was drifting from. Brooklyn was there, leaning against the marble counter we had argued over just days ago. He was wearing his dress shirt, unbuttoned and wrinkled, looking devastatingly casual and domestic, in a space that was supposed to be a corporate showpiece. He turned as I approached, and the look in his eyes wasn't regret. It was a calm, possessive warmth that anchored me to the floor. He didn't ask how I slept. He simply slid a steaming mug toward me and told me to drink it before I started overthinking everything, his voice raspy with sleep and deeply amused. I took the coffee, gripping the ceramic like a lifeline, and admitted quietly that overthinking was part of my job description. I told him we had a gala in 12 hours, a press team arriving in 4, and a sister who was going to land in 2 days and likely kill us both. Brooklyn walked around the island, ignoring my panic, and trapped me gently against the counter, his hands resting on either side of my hips. He looked down at me, his expression sobering instantly. He told me that he knew exactly what the schedule was, but he needed to know where we stood before the madness started. He brushed a thumb over my cheek, his touch grounding me, and said that he didn't do casual, and he certainly didn't sleep with his sister's best friend unless he intended to follow through. My breath hitched. He asked me, with a vulnerability that stripped away his billionaire persona, to stop looking for the exit sign and just look at him. He told me he wanted more than just a secret night in an empty penthouse. He wanted the mornings, the arguments, the boring meetings, and everything in between. He asked me to be with him, officially, not as his architect or his friend's distraction, but as his partner. "I'm not promising this will be simple," he added, his tone steady now. "The press will speculate, investors will talk. Mia may need time, and if at any point you feel exposed, we slow down." It wasn't a fairy tale declaration. It was deliberate, real, adult. The fear of Mia's reaction was still there, a sharp stone in my chest, but looking at him, at the man who had challenged me, listened to me, and undone me in the best possible way, the fear felt smaller than the hope. I set the coffee down and reached up, running my hands through his messy hair, whispering that I was terrified, but I was in. The relief that washed over his face was transformative. He kissed me hard, a seal on the promise we just made, before pulling back and murmuring against my lips that since we were official, I had a new job requirement for the night. He told me I wasn't just attending the gala to supervise the architecture anymore. I was going to walk the red carpet on his arm in front of the cameras, the press, and the entire city. The transformation from the dust-covered architect in the morning to the woman staring back at me in the evening mirror felt like a complete hallucination. The emerald silk gown Brooklyn had somehow arranged for me fit like a second skin, moving like liquid against my body with every breath I took. It was elegant, bold, and terrified me to my core. When I finally walked out to meet him in the hotel suite living area, the air left the room instantly. Brooklyn was adjusting his cufflinks, clad in a tuxedo that made him look devastatingly handsome and terrifyingly powerful. He stopped mid-motion, his dark eyes raking over me with a possessive heat that made my knees weak. He didn't say a word about the dress. He simply crossed the room in 2 long strides, wrapped his hand around the back of my neck, and kissed me until I was breathless, effectively ruining my lipstick and calming my racing heart all at once. The ride to the venue was a blur of city lights and nervous anticipation. I sat rigid in the back seat, my hand trembling slightly in his, acutely aware that the moment we stepped out of this car, there was no going back. We weren't just colleagues anymore. We were a statement. As the car slowed to a halt in front of the glittering venue, the flash of cameras erupted like a lightning storm. Panic surged in my throat, cold and sharp. I tried to pull my hand away, a reflex born of 10 years of hiding, but Brooklyn held on. He tightened his grip, interlacing our fingers firmly, and leaned in close, his voice a low, steady rumble against the chaotic noise outside. He whispered that I looked incredible, that I belonged there, and that he wasn't letting go of my hand for anyone. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the unwavering certainty in his gaze. I took a deep, shaky breath and nodded. The door opened and the noise of the crowd roared to life. Walking the red carpet on the arm of the city's most eligible bachelor was exactly as overwhelming as I feared. But the way Brooklyn kept his body angled toward mine, shielding me from the worst of the frenzy, made the rest of the world fade into the background. We moved through the ballroom like a single entity, fielding congratulations and curious stares. The champagne flowed, the music swelled, and for the first time in my life, I stopped worrying about the consequences. I let myself be happy. I let myself lean into him as we swayed on the dance floor, his hand warm and solid on the small of my back, pulling me flush against him. It was perfect. It was the kind of night you dream about as a little girl. But dreams have a nasty habit of breaking when you least expect it. As the song ended and Brooklyn leaned down to whisper something in my ear that made me laugh, the crowd near the main entrance suddenly parted. I turned my head casually, expecting another dignitary or investor. Instead, the blood drained from my face so fast the room spun. Standing there, holding a suitcase and a congratulations balloon, looking exhausted from a flight but smiling broadly as she scanned the room for her brother, was Mia. She had come home early to surprise him, and she was looking right at us. The music seemed to distort and fade into the background, leaving only the deafening thud of my heart as Mia stood there, clutching her suitcase like a shield. I instinctively tried to pull my hand from Brooklyn's grip, the old reflex of hiding our connection kicking in, but he refused to let me retreat. He tightened his fingers around mine, a silent, unyielding anchor in the middle of the storm, and leaned down to whisper that we were done apologizing for being happy. We walked toward her together, closing the distance that felt like miles. I opened my mouth to stammer out an explanation, desperate to save the friendship that had been my lifeline for a decade, but Mia held up a hand to stop me. She looked at her brother, standing tall and fiercely protective in his tuxedo, and then at me, wearing his emerald gown and a look of absolute terror. The silence between the three of us was thick enough to choke on, suspending the entire gala around us. Then, the shock on her face didn't soften, it sharpened. Her smile faded, not into anger, but into something quieter and far more painful. She looked at me first, not at her brother. "How long?" she asked, not accusing, not dramatic, just steady. The question hit harder than any scream could have. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Brooklyn stepped slightly forward, instinctively protective, but Mia raised a hand. "No, I'm asking her." The music, the crowd, the lights, everything disappeared. I forced myself to answer. I told her it had only been weeks that we tried to stop, that I was terrified of hurting her. My voice cracked when I admitted I was more afraid of losing her than anything else. The silence that followed stretched painfully. Then she exhaled slowly. "I'm not hurt because you love him," she said quietly. "I'm hurt because you thought you had to hide it from me." Her eyes moved between us. "Just don't lie to me again." And that was it. Not permission, not celebration, just honesty. The relief that washed over me was so intense my knees actually buckled, but Brooklyn was there to steady me, his arm wrapping securely around my waist. There was no dramatic betrayal, only the grounded reality of a best friend who knew us better than we knew ourselves. Later that night, high above the city in the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, the gala felt like a distant memory. Brooklyn pulled me out onto the balcony, the cool night wind playing with the loose strands of my hair. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me with that raw, unguarded intensity that still took my breath away. He pulled me flush against his chest, his hands sliding up to cup my face, and asked if I was finally ready to stop running. I smiled, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known was missing, and told him I was exactly where I was supposed to be. He lowered his head and kissed me, a slow, deep, devastatingly passionate kiss that tasted of champagne and forever, sealing the promise that some rules are simply meant to be broken. And that is the end of our story. I really hope you enjoyed following this journey as much as I enjoyed telling it. Please, take a moment to rate this story from 1 to 10 in the comments below. I read every single one, and I'd love to know what you think. Thank you so much for listening and being part of this channel. A new story is coming soon. Don't miss it. Bye.